When we talk about color, we also have to talk about these two qualities here: value, which is the relative lightness or darkness of your colors, and also the color juxtaposition. And what that means is, what do the colors look like when they're placed next to each other? So, value and contrast is the relationship between the various lightness or darkness. Now, a very important thing to understand as a designer is that the human eye will always be drawn to where there is the greatest contrast. So if I put something white on a black background or black on a white background, as you can see in the corners up here, your eye will automatically go to where there's the greatest contrast. And why that's important for you as a designer is part of your job as a designer is to direct the viewer's eye around the page or the package to basically tell them what you need them to look at first, second, third, and so on here. So working with the value contrast is one of the ways you can do that. So again, the eye will always be drawn to white on black or black on white. That's usually where the eye will go first. You'll notice here as this background goes into the gray range and the squares change to gray, you're noticing that you actually start losing some of the edges here. And that's because the value of the gray square is almost identical to the value of the gray in the background, and you start losing the edges on there. So we talked about this with the last lecture talking about color, and again down the center here you have the pure hue of red, yellow, and blue. As you add white to the left you get tints, and that's a lighter value. As you go to the right you add black and you get a darker value, that's a shade. And you can really see why that's important when I look at, or when I show you guys the one of the original Apple logos from way back in the day, when they had the kind of rainbow colored logo over there. So if you look at the original logo on the far left, you have 6 very distinct color bands going through the logo. As I move across the page and I start pulling the color out, and I'm basically reducing it just down to its lightness or darkness, by the time you get over here, instead of having 6 distinct bands, I kind of have 3. Excuse me. Because you'll notice, even though these yellow-orange, the orange and the reddish-orange color here, these look very, very distinct as hues, when you reduce them down to just their lightness or darkness, you realize they have almost identical value. They fall exactly the same place with that gray scale. Same thing down here, the violet or purple color and the blue, totally distinct, but it turns out they're almost identical on the value scale, and you lose that distinction between the two lines there. So when we talk about color and lightness or darkness, what we're talking about is color saturation. That's how much of the hue is in there. So as you add white, or as you add, if you add white for a tint, you're taking the saturation out of that. If you add black, you're also taking the saturation out and turning it into a shade. And then at the bottom here, if you actually add gray, not black, but if you add gray, then what you're creating is what we refer to as a tone. We also, when we talk about color, need to talk about how colors look next to each other. And this is a classic example. If you look at the 4 squares here, the gray circle in the center of each of them looks different. And on the white square, the gray looks dark. On the black square, the circle looks lighter. The reality is all 4 gray circles are exactly the same. It's just what's changing is the color you put them on, the background color you're putting them on. So again, the eye's drawn to where you have contrast on the top with the black and the white, but if you look at the red and the blue squares at the bottom, they actually have a very close value to the grays themselves as far as where they fall on that lightness and darkness scale. So you don't get the contrast, you don't get the pop that you would get on the black or white background. So it's always a good idea in whatever you do for a design, be it a label design or a poster design or even a logo design, is maybe test drive a bunch of colors, because depending on what colors you put next to each other, you can get a totally different emotional response to them. So here's a poster design, and the design doesn't change. The only thing that changes is the colors and how they affect each other next to each other. So if you look in the center, the kind of graphic representation of the room with the black and the white, that's a really high contrast. It's kind of a harsher look to it. On the left, I've taken away the dark black and replaced it with the blue, and the yellow's been replaced with an orange background. Those are kind of medium value colors, and you can see it's softened it a little bit, so you don't have the harshness that you get with the center color palette. And then on the far right, it's kind of a mix. Instead of black, I've got a dark brown, so you still have some contrast on there, but it's not as harsh as it is with the pure black and white. So I always recommend with all your designs, even if you have a pretty good idea of the colors you want to use, test drive some other color combinations or color palettes and see if it's the actual best solution for you. Keep in mind too, especially for packaging design, some things you need to take into consideration. Packaging, again, is oftentimes viewed from a distance from 3 or 4 feet away. So you need to be able to have that contrast so you can see, read the type or read the graphics on the packaging. So good qualities, you can see the black on the light background, the yellow, that's got good contrast, or white on a dark blue background. Again, you have that contrast, it makes it highly visible. On the right, 2 problems that crop up. The first one is something we touched on in the last lecture, that vibration that happens when you use complementary colors against each other. So green and red are complements, and when you put them full strength against each other, if you stare at that for a second, it'll probably start giving you a headache. The other issue too is choosing colors where, again, they fall about in the same spot on that light to darkness scale. So you can see in the lower right corner there, the low visibility colors, even though it's a blue and a green, they both fall kind of in the same gray range, and so it makes it very hard to read. And in fact, if you squint your eyes, the type will almost disappear. Keep in mind with packaging design and logo design as well, you always have to plan ahead and know whether your design is going to have to work on a light background or a dark background. Oftentimes it might have to work on both. There may be situations where your design can't be used in color, maybe for things such as invoices or kind of back of the house paperwork. You want to have your logo or design on it, but you don't want to spend the money for full color printing. So does your design work if you reduce it to black and white as well? We talk about some visual cues and some tricks of the trade we use in design. One of the things we take into consideration is the psychology of color. And I touched on this in the last lecture, where there's certain colors that we associate with certain qualities. For something natural or organic, going to greens or earth tones might be a way to go. This is a well-documented case too, where the yellow-red color combination has been shown to trigger hunger in people who view it. And so there's a reason why almost every fast food logo uses this red and yellow color combination. They're hoping you drive down the street, see the sign, get hungry, dive into the drive-through lane and pick up a Big Mac. So some common color associations, red with passion, love, urgency. Yellow tends to be a very cheerful, warm, optimistic color. I mentioned green. Blue obviously has connotations to water, sky, peace, serenity. And so these are things that you can take into consideration when you start choosing colors for your label design. One thing that's been in the news for the last few years too is the tendency, which they've tried to get away from, of using colors to gender various products. So you really see this in toys. Things that are aimed at girls or boys kind of go for that pink or blue color scheme. And then, especially when we talk about branding and packaging, one of the things to take into consideration is using color as part of your branding. And I'll talk more about this when we talk about Pantone colors, but there are certain brands that have really adopted very specific colors for their branding. Coke famously uses black, white, silver, and red as their branding. And probably the most famous example of using color as branding is Tiffany and Company, the high-end jeweler. They have this custom mixed color. It's a PMS color, which we'll talk about Pantone colors in a second. And they have this copyrighted. It's PMS 1837. That's the year Tiffany was formed or founded. They have copyrighted that. So if you open a jewelry store, you cannot use that color. Now, if you open a restaurant and want to use that color, you can go for it. Tiffany only has the copyright when it comes to accessories and jewelry. So I mentioned category conventions and colors here, using earth tones or greens for organic or natural product. That's something you might want to take into consideration. Also, understanding cultural meanings in color. There's certain colors have certain connotations in different cultures, and understanding those are important. If you think in terms in Western culture, the color black, we tend to, one of the associations we have with black is death and mourning. But if you go into a lot of Eastern cultures, the color they associate with death and mourning is white. And if you go into Persian culture, the color they associate with death and mourning is actually red. So understanding certain colors have certain meanings, especially if you're designing packaging that's going to cross into other countries or other cultures, you need to make sure you understand that. We've talked about the basic hues of the rainbow. And the thing to understand too when it comes to packaging, those 6 colors kind of break down into what we call the cool colors. So violet, purple, blue, and green, or the warm colors. How that works is if you're designing, again, something that's spicy or hot sauce, you might want to consider using warm colors. If you're designing packaging for ice cream, maybe, excuse me, you consider the cool colors on there. That being said, it's important to understand you can have warm cool colors and cool warm colors. So on the top, on the far right, you have the red. If I add blues to that, I'm going to take it more into a magenta range. Now, it's still technically in the red family, but it's considered a cool red. It's a cool warm color. Same is true on the bottom. If I start with a blue on the far left, if I start adding yellow to that, it's going to warm it up and it will turn it more into kind of this steel blue color. Now, it's still technically considered a blue and therefore a cool color, but it's a warm cool color. Understanding how all your colors are going to work together is important. As I mentioned, I really advise you to test drive other colors, even if you have a pretty good idea where you want to end up. The colors you choose can be very important to projecting what your brand or your company is about. So here I have a generic logo in 3 different color palettes. If I were to ask you, which company logo do you think is for a candy company? You would probably go for the one at the bottom. It's in kind of those pastel kind of candy colors. If I was to tell you one of these logos was for an outdoor company like REI or something geared towards outdoor adventure or camping, you would probably think it was the center one because of the earth tones and the more natural colors. So understanding how these color combinations can play into perceptions of your brand is important. And again, I always advise that as you work on your design, take a minute every once in a while and test drive different colors against different backgrounds, different colors for your type or whatever graphics you may use in there, just to make sure that you've explored all options for the colors and how they work next to each other.